Chapter 4. Yet father and son got on together in a way for another year and more. Then came Advent in the following winter, and they were killing meat for Yule. Aunt Ketil and Liv came out to Hestviken in the pitch dark early morning. The man was to be butcher, his wife to help the women with puddings and the like. It had snowed the week before, enough to whiten the fields, but with the new moon came mild weather, and that morning, as Olav came out into the yard, the fog was so thick that they could scarce find their way between the houses. Olav told the men they must rope the pig before they drove the toughness out of it. If it escaped them in this fog, it might not be easy to catch it again. Olav stood on the doorstone, watching the torches lighting up the thick sea mist. A moment later they only showed as faint red gleams in the downy grey darkness, and then vanished. But soon after he heard cries and roars and the squealing of the pig, and men came running over the smooth rocks of the yard. Something dashed past him in the dark, and Olav guessed it was the pig. He tried to jump in the way of it, but it was gone in the dense gloom, making eastward across the fields. After it came the men with torches and brands through the mist, dark forms swathed in darkness. Olav ran on with them. Aunt Ketil and Eirik stooped as they ran, lighting up the pig's tracks in the snow. Olav halted by the barn, and old Thor told him how it had happened. Eirik was to have held the pig, while Aunt Ketil got on its back to ride it tender, and then he had let go. One of the pigs that were not for slaughter had got loose at the same time. So this pig's flesh was to be effectually worked into softness before they stuck it. They could hear it through the fog. Olav knew of old that Eirik was always squeamish on pig-killing days, but then nobody likes them. And the lad was still as clumsy as ever when he had to lend a hand with a beast. It made things no better when he tried to conceal his shrinking with unbecoming flippancy and foolish jesting. The house-carles came back. They did not think they could catch the pigs again until the fog lifted, and they cursed over the waste of time. But an hour later Aunt Ketil and Eirik returned with the pig. It had run itself into a drift of thawing snow. Olav went indoors again and lay down on the bench. It was the custom that the master of the house should keep away from pig-killing, and only show himself in the yard when he brought out the ale bowl for the refreshment of the butchers. He lay listening to the pig's shrieks. It was quite preposterous the time it took today before the life was out of it. It was already daylight outside, stiff with grey fog, when Olav went across with Aunt Ketil to the cookhouse. On the snow outside it lay the pig's carcass, split in two. Under the cookhouse wall stood Eirik and little Asta, the youngest of the serving maids. They were washing themselves in the water butt, laughing and splashing each other. Eirik was not aware of his father for the fog. He made a dash at the girl and tried to dry his hands on her clothes. His conduct was not very seemly. Asta screamed, but laughed still more and made no great struggle to escape the lad's forwardness, and Eirik made free with his hands under her kirtle. The next instant Olav had him by the neck and flung him aside. Eirik had a glimpse of his father's face, grey and wild with fury. Then he got a blow of his fist on the jaw which made him reel. His father caught him again, shook him and hurled him backwards, so that he fell at full length in the snow. "Be off, you foul trollop," said Olav to Asta. She was standing there awkwardly. The girl slipped away. "And you, stand up." He gave Eirik a push with his foot. Eirik rose to his feet and stood dazed before his father. Olav said in a low voice, shaking with rage, "Do you think you can behave this way in your father's house, you and your bitch, in broad daylight before folks' eyes, like a dog?" Eirik turned red as fire. He too began to tremble with rage. "It's not true! I was only jesting." His anger brought him to the verge of tears, and then he shouted, "May I not touch one of the maids here without you thinking that I shall deal with her as you did with Torhild?" He raised his arms to fend off the blow. Olaf threw him and was on top of him. He crushed the boy with his knees as he lay in the miry, blood-stained snow. He did not desist as long as he felt any sign of resistance in the body beneath him. Eirik lay limply, with his face half buried in the snow, as Olaf stood up and left him. Old Tor had stood still watching Olaf punishing his son. Now he knelt down in the dirty slush and tended the unconscious lad. Later in the day they found the other pig that Eirik had allowed to escape in the early morning. It lay in the hollow behind the outhouses in a pool of slush. It was dead. Olaf shrugged his shoulders when they came and reported the mischance. He clenched his teeth. He had not chastised Eirik too severely that morning. No one saw any more of Eirik that day, nor was it noticed, so busy was the household. It was only old Tor who had seen Olaf strike Eirik. The other housefolk remarked, no doubt, that there was discord once more between father and son, but that happened so often. But at dusk, when Olaf came in from outside, there was someone standing in the anteroom. He followed the master into the empty hall and closed the door behind him. It was Eirik. A few logs were burning on the hearth. In the uncertain flicker, Olaf could see that the lad's face was bruised and swollen. Olaf seated himself on the bench. On the table lay a bannock and a tasty sausage, smoking hot. The man took a bite of the food, chewed and ate slowly. But Eirik stood erect and silent in the shadows. "What do you want?" asked his father at last, reluctantly. "I wonder if you yourself believed what you said." Eirik began so calmly and naturally that his father wondered at him, and then felt a chill of remote misgiving. Never had he heard the boy speak in this way. "If you think it so ill of me to trifle with the young maid, then you are not very reasonable, father. But you are seldom reasonable or just with me." Olaf pushed away his food. He sat upright on the bench. A feeling of tension clutched at his heart. Then a cold clearness of vision came upon him, like acknowledging a defeat. Eirik was surely right. The son paused for a moment. Then he spoke as before. "It is almost as though you had taken a hatred to me, father." But as the man on the bench still sat motionless, Eirik went on more hotly, more like his usual self. "The way you treat us, one would almost think you had taken a hatred to your own children. You grant your son no honour and no authority. You keep me as a child, and I am in my 16th winter." His voice had broken now, turning to a scream. "I can see that you think so," said his father. And presently he added with a touch of scorn, "Nevertheless, you are very young, Eirik, to judge your own worth." Eirik turned and went out. Eirik had already crept under the skins in his bed, so it appeared, when Olaf came in that night to go to rest. The little girls were already asleep in the south bed, and Marta was still busy in the cookhouse. But the next morning, when the lady went to wake Eirik, she found nothing but a bundle underneath the coverlet. Sticks and straw tumbled out when she took hold of the old cloak. Marta was angry. She thought that the boy had done this to make a fool of her. Olaf was standing by and saw it. For a moment he felt alarmed, absurdly, as he saw at once. He turned away in annoyance. What wretched child's tricks! The boy had not been in his bed that night. He wished to show he was offended. But such nonsense as this bundle? Then it struck the man. Surely he had not gone to Asta to defy him. Ah, if that was so, he should have a beating he had never dreamt of. He would ask no questions. But by the afternoon it was clear to the whole household that Eirik was not on the manor. None of the boats was missing, and his horse stood in the stable. There was the same thick, wet fog again today. It was vain to search for the boy, nor could Olaf spare any men to send out. But he wondered where Eirik had betaken himself. To Ringel, or Skikjulstad, or perhaps to that Jorund reaper. At night the wind got up from the south, and it began to rain. In the course of the day the fields were all a mirror of ice. The air was filled with a roaring blast from sea and woods. As yet Olaf had not uttered a word to his housefolk about the matter. Lady Marta tried to speak of it, but Olaf cut her short. Now and again anxiety dragged at him. The boy could not have taken it so that surely he had not fallen over somewhere in the night and the fog. Thoughts crowded upon him which he strove to drive away. It was unlikely. He found occasion to see to the boats, took courage and looked under the sheds and the quay, went round the shore of the bay, all the while saying to himself, Eirik is surely at Ringel. He had always been Una's favourite. On Sunday he met both the Ringel folk and those of Skikjulstad at church. After Mass he fell into talk with Jorund Reefer's kinsmen. He saw at once that they knew nothing of Eirik's flight. He went over to the parsonage. Several people had been in there to speak with the priest, and Mass had been late that day, for the roads were almost impassable after the bad weather. Sire Halbjorn had not yet tasted bite nor sup. He was pale about the nose from his long fast. Olaf told him his son had run away. "Ah, and none too soon either," said the priest. His ancient housekeeper came limping in with the dish of porridge. The men moved forward and took their places at the table. The priest and the deacon said grace. Olaf stood silently waiting at the door. With a mute gesture, Sire Halbjorn invited him to sit down with them and break his fast. Olaf thanked him, but said he must go home. But he asked the priest to come to the outer door with him. He had something to say to him. Sire Halbjorn went out reluctantly. "Do you know anything of Eirik, Sire? You have heard no rumour of where he is gone?" "Aye." Olaf went out, angry. His horse stood outside in the rain, hanging its head. The water poured off its mane, running in streams among the darkened strands. It fell in a sheet from the cloak he had laid over the saddle and the horse's quarters when he put it on. On the way he looked in at Rundmere and questioned Anki and Lieb closely, making no concealment. They denied all knowledge of the matter, and Olaf saw that they spoke the truth for once. In the evening he asked Asta, swallowed his pride, and questioned the young serving-maid. "You can surely tell me, Asta, where Eirik has gone, since you two were such good friends?" The girl turned red, and tears came into her eyes. She timidly shook her head. "But he came and said farewell to you, did he not, before he took himself off?" Asta broke into sobs. "There was no tie of friendship between me and Eirik, Master Olaf. Eirik had only jested a little with her once or twice. Eirik was good-natured, wanton but kind. On seeing her master's little crooked smile, she wept outright, and swore most solemnly that she never forgot the teachings of her honest parents. Her honour and good name were without stain or blemish. "All right. But if you let the young lads handle you, as I saw that morning, you will soon find yourself without either the one or the other," said Olaf sternly. Now go and cry outside." Then there was nothing left but to peer into his own despair. All day long Olaf cudgelled his brains to find some credible explanation. What could Eirik have done? He had gone away in his great hooded cloak, and taken his sword and spear with him. A little gold pin in the band of his shirt, and a great brooch in the bosom of his jerkin. These, and his finger ring with the red agate, he always wore. Had he made for the town, he might have provided himself with lodging by selling one of these trinkets. He might have gone to Klaus Wiepart, or to the armourer's, or to one of the monasteries. Or, if he had been able to get carried across the fjord, to Tunsberg. Likely enough the lad might have taken it into his head to seek his fortune, where so many lords were passing to and fro. Between whiles, Olaf tried to fan into flame his first indignation at Eirik's flight. But at night he lay awake, and then his thoughts would only dwell on what might have happened to Eirik. He might have lost his way in the fog that night, have fallen over the cliff somewhere. For the son of Hestviken Manor was well enough known to many. It was incredible that he could disappear as if he had sunk into the ground, or carried off, spirited away, spellbound by the powers of evil. And now Olaf called to mind all the stories Eirik had told as a child, about his intercourse with the folk of that world. There might have been some truth in it after all, even if he had made up a lot of it. Or, if he had been out on the fjord the second day after he ran from home, many boats' crews had not been heard of since that day. Nor were the roads inland so safe, but that it might be dangerous for a young lad, well dressed and armed, with jewels on him, to travel alone. Northward in the forests about Gerderud there were reports of robbers. Or, for all that, Olaf knew not a little of Eirik's fickle nature. He turned to melancholy as suddenly as to sport and dalliance. But he could not surely have taken his correction so much to heart as to throw himself into the fjord. "Ingunn, Ingunn, Ingunn mine, help me! Where is the boy? Jesus Mary, where is Eirik?" Olaf rose on his knees in the bed, with his head in his clasped hands. He leaned his forehead against the foot of the bed. "Not for myself do I pray for mercy. Holy Mary, I taught the boy these prayers myself when he was a child. Remember that now." But that was an age ago. He did not know whether Eirik remembered anything of them now. It was an age since he had thought of teaching the children anything of that sort. Cecilia, never a word. He left that to Marta. It had come to this, that he could not and dared not. But God, they must not suffer for it. He prayed God to take Eirik under his protection. He prayed God's mother for his son. He prayed St. Olaf and St. Eirik, as he had never been wont to pray before. Sometimes it made him a little calmer. For himself he cared not now, but for the young lad, Ingunn's son. He never thought of Cecilia in that way, that she was Ingunn's daughter as much as his. He could not prevent the servants from talking of Eirik's flight. He himself said hardly anything, but he listened stiffly and intently, whether the others might have heard some news. The southerly weather held. A draught of wind whistled through the church on Christmas Eve, levelling the flames of the candles in the lustrous choir whenever the storm came down with full force. The vault above was darkened, and then the heavy doors shook, and the window shutters rattled, as if the spirits of the tempest flung themselves with all their might against every barrier, in their fury to thwart the sacred ceremony that was proceeding in the choir. There was a howling and piping about the corners of the building, a vast droning in the ash trees on the ancient burial mounds beyond the churchyard fence. Through the roaring dissonance of the storm, the singing of the mast sounded strangely still and strong, like the smooth streak of a current in the midst of a rough sea. The moment the silver bells chimed and the congregation knelt, while Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus resounded from the choir, it fell still. The candle flames recovered themselves and gleamed erect. The painted images on the whitened walls of the chancel seemed to spring forth, shining in their blue and yellow and rust-red colours. Sira Halbjorn's tall form, clad in pure white linen with the golden chasuble, appeared like that of an angel, descending straight from the heavenly visions of St. John, a bearer of good tidings and a herald of God's judgment. Then came a fresh gust of wind, crashing and roaring against the walls. The choir was plunged in gloom as the priest bent over the paten whispering. The tolling of the bell in the ridge turret over the people's heads was drowned in the raging of the storm. When the congregation rose to its feet after the Agnus Dei, Olav Audunsson remained sunk on his knees. Bard Palsson from Skiktrestad, who stood by his side, bent down, trying to look into his face in the darkness. "Are you sick, Olav?" Olav shook his head and stood up. After Mass, Olav and Bard struggled side by side across the green to the tithe barn. The great lantern under the roof swayed hither and thither. Everywhere in the shadows they descried the forms of folk who lay in the straw to take a short rest before the Mass of the shepherds. Olav unhooked his cloak and shook the rain from it. "Are you sick?" asked Bard again. "You are as pale as a ghost." "No," said Olav. He went in and lay down in the straw, where some men moved closer to make room for the two. "That's good, but I thought it," said Bard, "since you were not with Eirik. I saw how pale you turned tonight, and I thought maybe you had been unwell. Gunnar and Arn spoke of it. They thought it strange that you let your son travel that way alone, with only a token." "What do you mean?" Olaf managed to say. Bard made no answer. He could not follow. "Gunnar and Arn? Is it Arn of Haugsvik you speak of?" As Bard said nothing, Olaf resumed as unconcernedly as he could. "It was not with my consent that Eirik left home, nor against my will either. He thought he was old enough to shift for himself now, so I thought, let him try it. Then he took the road for Oslo," Olaf ventured at a hazard. "He came through safe and well?" he asked, when he received no answer. "Yes, he came through safe and well," replied Bard sleepily. "It was the day of the storm, and he had been in good heart," said Arn, "when the lad parted from them. But out at Haugsvik, when he came and asked for a place in their boat, he had told them there was an agreement between Olaf and one of the great lords in the town that Eirik should enter his service in order to learn the trade of war and courtly ways. No, Eirik had refused to say who his new lord was to be. That was his way, always such an air of secrecy." Olaf lay with his hands clasped under his cloak. "God, my God, I thank thee. Mary, most clement, most kind, what shall I do to show my gratitude?" Memories of burnt-out thoughts stirred like ashes driven off by a puff of wind. Now that was all over. But he would give something to her poor. A cow to Ingunn, whose son was a leper. But as he rode homeward after the morning mass, in pouring rain, the wind had dropped now, his anger revived. Such conduct he had never heard of, indeed. And there had been the usual bragging and romancing out at Haugsvik, he could guess. A token, it occurred to Olav. What could that token be? Surely Eirik had not taken something. Olaf's seal, or seal ring, for instance, and run away from home as a thief. He sat leaning over the table, silent and gloomy, scarcely noticing his housecarls who fell upon the steaming dish of meat. Now and again he recollected himself sufficiently to raise the ale bowl, drink to them, and let it go round. Afterwards he went in and turned over his store of treasures, but nothing was missing. His wrath came and went in waves, died down, and gave place to uneasiness. Eirik had made his way to Oslo. More than that he did not know as yet, and there was no saying what he might fall into there. There was no help for it. He would have to go and find out about his son, ill as it suited him to leave home at this time. At last, on 12th day, Olaf met with a farmer up the parish who had spoken with Eirik in the town. He had been into Nonneseter at Yule. The convent owned a share in the farm he occupied, and therefore he had come upon Eirik in the guests' refectory. He sat waiting while his master, Ragnvald Thorvaldsson, had speech with the abbess. The day after, Olaf sailed into Oslo. Inside the Sigvalda rocks the fjord was frozen over. A great number of boats had been left at the edge of the ice, and there was not a horse to borrow at any of the farms round about. So Olaf let old Thor stay with their boat while he walked alone across the ice to the town. He found Thomas Tabor and sent him out to the old royal castle at the river mouth. Ragnvald had custody of the place. But Eirik did not come to his father's inn the first day. The evening of the second day was wearing on, and still Olaf sat there waiting. The travellers, as many as were at home, lay under the skins in their sleeping places. It was cold. The hostess sat dozing by the hearth, huge in her sheepskin wraps. She was only waiting till it was time to rake over the fire and bar the door. Olaf sat upon his bed, with his hands hanging over his knees. His legs were like ice from the cold of the floor, and he was dull with waiting. The woman got up to tend the 2 lanterns that hung at each end of the long hall of the inn. "Will you not go to bed, master?" And then there was a knock at the door. It was Eirik. Olaf went a few steps to meet him, and gave him his hand in greeting. They happened to come together just under the lantern. In a way, the father must have noticed before now that Eirik had grown taller than himself, and that shadows of dark down had begun to appear about his mouth. But never before had he been wholly aware of the change. Eirik was grown up. He was well dressed, wearing a plain steel cap, and under it a dark blue woolen hood, which framed the narrow, swarthy face, making it seem yet narrower. His long cloak was brown and of good material. Under it he was clad in a tight leather jerkin, and he wore a sword at his belt, in token that he was now one of his lord's men-at-arms. Long iron spurs jingled as he walked. "You will not get me back with you to Hestviken, father," he said, as soon as Olaf let go his hand. "I had not thought to do so either," replied Olaf. "If you have taken service with the Lord, you must know that I would not have you run from it before your time." To the hostess, who came up and asked whether she should bring drink for him and his guests, he replied yes, the best German beer. "But," said Olaf, as they seated themselves on his bed, "I would have liked it better if you had spoken to me before you made off. But it is useless to talk of that now." Eirik blushed slightly, and asked with embarrassment, "You have business that brings you here, then?" "My business is to give you what you need. You shall be provided as befits my son when you go out into the world." Olaf pulled out of the bed a bag of clothes, a good battle-axe and the blade of a thrusting spear. Then he handed his son a purse. "Here are 4 marks of silver in good old money. It is my will that you get yourself a horse as soon as you can, that you may be held of more account. It ill befits a man-at-arms to ride his master's horse like a serving man of villein birth. More than that you shall not have of me, Eirik, so long as you stay abroad. You have chosen to be master of your own conduct, so be it then, and let it be such that you win honour in that way." Eirik rose and thanked his father with a kiss of the hand. It gave him a warm thrill that his father spoke to him as a grown man. It was not often his father had addressed so long a speech to him. And yet there was a shade of disappointment that this meeting did not turn out as he had pictured it to himself ever since Thomas Tabor brought him Olaf's message. He had expected his father to be greatly angered, to threaten, and command him to return. And then he would have made answer. But it seemed his father had taken his flight very calmly, and had no thought at all of bringing him home again. "Thank you, I am not hungry." But for all that Eirik helped himself from his father's box of victuals, and took a good draught as often as Olaf offered him the tankard. At heart he very soon felt quite proud. It was an uncommon and almost a solemn occasion to be sitting here, eating and drinking with his father at an inn, and asking for news from home, 2 grown-up men together. "But how did you find out that I was here in Oslo, with Ragnvald?" Olaf smiled his little pinched smile. "Oh, I find out most of what I want to know, Eirik. When you have come to my age, perhaps you will have gotten so much wisdom as not to let men see everything that you know." Eirik turned red as flame. Memories of all kinds of secret misdeeds, great and small, in the whole of his young life hovered through his mind, and gave him a moment's insecurity. His father noticed it and smiled as before, but he went on talking calmly, gave his son good advice as to how he should conduct himself, now he was in a knight's service, spoke a little of his own youth. The last of the guests came into the inn. The curfew rang from the church towers, and Eirik said he must go. "I think to go home again tomorrow about midday. Maybe I shall not see you again before then?" asked his father. Eirik did not think he could come. No, I suppose not." Olaf went to the door with him. "Keep yourself well and in honour, Eirik. May God himself and his blessed mother be your protection." He kissed the young man on both cheeks and gave a little nod, as Eirik seemed to pause at the door. The lad had such a strange feeling at this solemn farewell, with the kisses of his father's hard, thin lips on his face. Olaf had business with Klaus Wiepart next day, and the German accompanied him across the common. Due south, the sun's disk shone through the light frost fog, gilding the surface of the ice. "Fine weather, Olaf." They turned into a narrow street between warehouses, which led to a strip of beach among the quays. From there the ice could be reached. From the common behind them came the noise of a band of horsemen, clanking of arms and harness. Olaf and Klaus had to cling to the walls as the troop thundered into the lane and rode past. At its head rode a short, thick-set knight. Olaf knew Ragnvald Thorvaldsson by sight. His men followed, one by one, for the lane was narrow. One of the horses was near being squeezed between 2 others. There was some confusion in the rank, and 1 or 2 horses reared. Olaf saw Eirik among the rest. He sat erect and easy in the saddle, but he did not see his father. he had enough to do to manage his horse, which seemed very fresh. He laughed and called to the man ahead of him in the crowd of steaming animals. "Was not that your son?" asked Klaus Wiepart. "It was." "Ah, time flies. Before one is aware of it, one is an old man. How old are you now, Master Olav?" 40 winters. "Then you are younger than you look, after all. Is it not 4 winters since Ingunn died? You are too young to let your beard grow, and to sleep wifeless on a winter's night." "You will see. I will shave off my beard yet, Klaus. And a wife I will get me too, if so be that such is my lot." Olaf gave a little laugh. Klaus bade him farewell and went back to his warehouse. Olaf walked out upon the ice where a path was marked on the gleaming coppery surface. He saw the band of horsemen far ahead. They were making across the creek towards Akersness, where the massive walls of King Hakon's new castle rose in the fine frosty mist. Again he felt the thought of Eirik like a cord that drew his heart together. But now it was like envy of the other's youth.